Now we're going to look at a cross-section of the oviduct. Oviduct is sometimes called the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. It's all the same thing. But anyway, if we were to cut through an oviduct and take out a tiny wedge of that oviduct and look at the wall and materials that make that up, we have a mucosa that's thrown into these ridiculously long, narrow folds on the inside. These sheets that come in from the outside toward the middle. It's almost like there's no lumen or cavity to the inside at all. There's no like open space down here because they all kind of overlap all the way around the wall of the oviduct. And the egg cell is supposed to pass through all of that on the way to the uterus. And it works. But anyway, it doesn't look like there's any room for things to move through there. There's an epithelium on the surface, and we're going to look at that here in a minute. It's a special kind of epithelium. Underneath that epithelium, there's a lamina propria. Beneath the lamina propria, there are two layers of muscle. So we have a muscularis layer out here. The muscularis layer with an inner circular and outer longitudinal. So that's kind of like what you'd see in your intestines there, that layering. But these are much thinner layers, of course, here. Outside of that, there's a serosa. So we have a layer of connective tissue and a mesothelium on the very outside of the oviduct. Okay? So, just to go over that again. Oviduct. This changes, by the way, quite a bit as you go from the ampular portion to the isthmus. These sheets and things have to get shorter. There's not as much diameter space on the inside of the oviduct as you go down toward the uterus. But anyway, throughout most of the oviduct, you have these long extended parts like this. An epithelium on the outside, lamina propria that kind of works in between those epithelial cells, the muscularis layer, and then a serosa layer to the outside. There's not a like submucosa like what we see in the intestine. There's not a muscularis mucosa. We go directly from lamina propria to the muscularis layer outside there. Now the epithelium that makes up this covering, I've made it in purple, so let's draw purple cells. There are two kinds of epithelium. There's basically kind of a jumbled looking kind of cellular arrangement through some of the oviduct, and these cells are what we call peg cells. Peg cells. And then other places there are ciliated cells, and the ciliated cells maintain more of a simple columnar appearance and have cilia on their surface. So these would be ciliated cells. Ciliated cells and peg cells make up that epithelial layer to the oviduct. I should also mention that as you go down the oviduct, the peg cells here become more abundant down toward the isthmus and the uterine portion. The ciliated cells are more abundant out in the ampulla and the infundibular portion and along the fimbria to generate that flow, that current of fluid that moves the egg down the oviduct. Here we have a couple of pictures of the oviduct. We don't have great pictures of the oviduct. Your book has a good picture that compares your peg cells and your ciliated cells, so I suggest you look at that. Along the edge, these dark cells in here are the mostly peg cells probably, although I think some of those are ciliated right there. But anyway, these are the lining epithelial cells, and then going out into these extensions, all this is connective tissue. That's our lamina propria. Right over here we have smooth muscle arranged in first there's an inner circular layer, and then there's an outer longitudinal bit outside of that. And then the outer layer should have a mesothelium on the outside, but this does not. There's an artery here and a vein right through here. So these are the connective tissues outside of the oviduct. One more picture. This is not quite as good, but again, we have the space of the oviduct and the wall thrown into these ridiculous folds toward the inside, and then we get into smooth muscle. This is a smooth muscle layer all the way out to here, and then this is smooth muscle in longitudinal view out here. So we get all the way to the outside where there's really not much connective tissue showing up on the outside of that specimen. Here we have a portion of the lining of the uterine wall. Remember that the innermost part of the uterus in here, this is referred to as endometrium. So that would be our endometrium. Our myometrium starts here, and it would be extremely thick. It would go on for quite a long distance compared to this thickness of endometrium right here. Our endometrium has two zones to it. We have a lighter zone out here with glands that come in, and then we have another zone down here that has a darker appearance in here. This is the stratum functional. No, sorry, stratum basal. That's what I mean to say. Stratum basal. And this is a stratum functional. They're given those names because this functional zone is the one that increases in thickness in the first part of the hormonal cycle to accept the embryonic, developing embryo, that it would embed in the wall of the uterus here if pregnancy were to occur. If pregnancy does not occur, then the egg cell does not embed itself into the wall of the endometrium, and these cells will be lost. All of these will break down and be lost because we don't have the progesterone maintaining the endometrial lining in there. So anyway, this undergoes a progressive series of stages. After it is lost, it has to be regrown. And as it regrows, first of all, you have to establish the epithelium on the surface, which is a simple columnar epithelium. So that's the main surface component there, and that same simple columnar epithelium also extends into these glands. So the glands are also a simple columnar epithelium. The tissues underlying that are what we call a highly cellular connective tissue. More cells are small and rounded, and there's not much additional production of collagen in there. It's mainly just cells, but they're more loosely packed here in the stratum functional, more densely packed here in the stratum basal. Now the stratum basal allows the regrowth of the stratum functional after menstruation. So we start regrowing from this base we maintain back here, that stratum basal. In addition to these highly cellular connective tissues and the glands that are in here, we also have some blood vessels that grow from the stratum basal out into the stratum functional, and initially they're just simple arteries and capillaries that grow out here, but eventually you get the formation of what are called spiral arteries out into that stratum functional. Larger vessels deliver more blood, so we have a high content of blood, a good blood supply out here in the later stages of the development of the stratum functional, getting it ready for the implantation of an embryo. Now, in the female hormonal cycle, the first part of the hormonal cycle is dominated by estrogens, and under the influence of estrogens, we see the regrowth phase, what we call the proliferative phase, and then after we get the full thickness to develop, progesterones become more important in developing what we call the secretory phase, where the glands become larger and the vessels develop more extensively. So the more mature later stage, ready for implantation of the embryo, occurs after ovulation and under the influence of progesterone. And if progesterone is lost after the corpus luteum regresses, then all of this is going to be lost along with the blood supply, all the surface tissues of the endometrium. So that's the endometrial tissues there. Underneath of that, like we said, smooth muscle, very thick layer of smooth muscle. It goes every which direction, and it's mixed with a lot of connective tissue. Has a good blood supply there as well. So anyway, you have a thick muscular zone, and then a very, very thin, what we call perimetrium. It's just a thin serosal membrane on the very outside. It does have a mesothelial covering, so it is a true serosa on the outside of the uterus. Now, down in the cervical canal, we still have some glands to occur down in the cervical canal, for the first part of it anyway, but eventually you replace the columnar epithelium of the surface with a stratified squamous epithelium, the same kind of epithelium you find in the vaginal canal. So you transition in the cervix from columnar epithelium to a stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. Now we're looking at the uterus. This is the lining of the uterus, a simple columnar epithelium along the edge, and this highly cellular connective tissue in here. Notice that it's kind of sparse, and there are not a lot of fibers going on, just more like a mesenchyme-like tissue growing back and rebuilding the endometrial lining. Remember, this is stratum functionale, the inner portion here. Next, here we see a gland. This columnar epithelium continues on down into the wall to form a uterine gland in the endometrium. Again, we have these scattered cells that are a little more organized here than in that last view. In this view, this is probably more stratum basale over here, and we're heading towards stratum functionale over to the right side of the screen. But there's an artery here, an artery here, an artery here, a small artery right there, and another artery there. So anyway, there's some blood vessels coming out into this part of the endometrial lining. And these are all glands of the endometrium. And like I said, this is stratum basale. The density of your connective tissue cells kind of give that away as a stratum basale layer. The next picture compares the stratum basale and stratum functionale in terms of that density. So everything over here on this side, this right 2/3 of the screen here, all of that is the stratum functionale. That will be lost in menstruation. This over here is stratum basale. All of this will remain, and then the next endometrial lining will regrow from this tissue over on the left, where it's a little darker because of the density of the cells in here. Lots of glands and some blood vessels in this view. This is the stratum functionale at the second week after menstruation. This is what we would consider the proliferative phase, where we're just growing more tissue at this stage, and we don't have as many glands and vessels, and we have a very loose connective tissue arrangement out there, that cellular connective tissue. At the third week, the next picture is going to show that, I think. No, hang on. There we go. The third week, we have a lot more glands, and we have a little higher density of that connective tissue, those connective tissue cells through the stratum functionale. But the glands are more abundant and enlarged throughout. Now, since the uterus and the other structures above here lie in the body cavity, they're all surrounded by a serosal membrane with a mesothelium. That outer covering with the mesothelium comes down about as far as the cervix, but then the body wall reflects back out around like this, so that the lower portion of the cervix and then the vagina, all of that is not within the body cavity, surrounded by connective tissues, so the outer covering here would be an adventitial type covering. The layering of the vaginal wall here is not very complicated. It's got an inner layer of stratified squamous, epithelium. Underneath of that would be a layer of lamina propria. Underneath of that, the third layer would be the muscularis, which is much thinner than what you see in the uterus. It has basically an inner circular and an outer layer of muscle. Inner circular and outer longitudinal layers, and then finally the very outside would be a connective tissue with blood vessels and nerves and so forth, probably fat, and adventitia. Simple layered wall to the vagina here. Remember, we have the transition from columnar epithelium of the uterus to that stratified squamous non-keratinized here in the lower portion of the cervix. Here we have a slide of the vaginal wall, the stratified squamous epithelium, non-keratinized over here to the left. Then a fairly good zone of connective tissue in here, and then we get into the muscle bundles. Notice how the muscle is not continuous. It's well separated by lots of connective tissue out here. That's very similar to the way it is in the uterine lining, or the uterus wall, the myometrium portion as well. But anyway, this is a smooth muscle in the wall of the vagina. This is all connective tissue. We're going to take another look at that a little closer. And we'll notice that this looks more like a dense, irregular connective tissue than a loose connective tissue at this point. It's very similar to dermis, so this would be like the reticular layer of the dermis, and there's very little that's loose connective tissue out here toward the surface. And of course, this is the stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelium.